Picture a crumbling English manor, Styles Court, where shadows hide a deadly game. Hercule Poirot, old and frail, returns to the scene of his first triumph, sensing a sinister force. A poisoned dog, a near-fatal overdose, and whispers of manipulation point to Edward Allerton, a man whose subtle words drive others to ruin. As tension grips the household, Poirot faces a chilling choice: break his moral code to stop a killer no court can touch. In his final case, one act of justice will change everything. Will you unravel the truth before the curtain falls? Chapter 1. The Return to Stylesdale. Train's rhythmic clatter was a faint echo of the past for Captain Arthur Hastings as he gazed through the smudged window at the patchwork of English fields. The hedgerows, blurred by the train's speed, seemed to weave memories of youth, of a time when life was less shadowed by loss. Styles Court awaited him, that sprawling manor where he had first crossed paths with Hercule Poirot, the diminutive Belgian detective whose brilliance had reshaped Hastings' understanding of justice. Now, decades later, a letter in meticulous script had summoned him back. The note was terse, almost curt, with an urgency that prickled Hastings' instincts. Come at once, mon ami. There is little time. No further explanation. No hint of the matter at hand, only the address of Styles and a plea for haste. Hastings adjusted his hat, feeling the weight of years in his stiffening joints. The war had come and gone, leaving its scars on the world, and on him. He wondered what state he would find Poirot in, still dapper, no doubt, with that fastidious moustache and those piercing eyes, but perhaps softened by age. The thought brought a pang of affection, tempered by unease. Poirot never summoned without reason, and his reasons were seldom trivial. The station at Styles St. Mary was a sleepy affair, its platform deserted save for a porter who tipped his cap with mechanical courtesy. A hired car carried Hastings through lanes fringed with wildflowers, their colours muted under a slate-grey sky. Styles Court loomed into view, its once proud facade now pocked with lichen, its chimneys tilting like weary sentinels. The lawns, which Hastings remembered as pristine, were choked with weeds, and the rose garden was a tangle of thorns. Time, it seemed, had been no kinder to Styles than to its former guests at the door. A housekeeper, grey-haired, stern, and new to Hastings, led him to the drawing-room. There sat Poirot, not at his usual perch by the fire, but in a wheelchair, his frail form swathed in a tartan blanket. His moustache, though still waxed, drooped at the edges, and his eyes, once bright as polished jet, were clouded with fatigue. Yet they gleamed with recognition as Hastings entered. Mon ami, Poirot said, his voice a fragile thread. You have come. I knew you would. The handshake was weak, but the grip held a flicker of the old determination. They took tea in the drawing-room, its faded grandeur a mirror to Poirot's own decline. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the chandelier was dulled by dust. Poirot sipped his tisane chamomile. Hastings noted, not the rich chocolate he once favoured, and spoke in measured tones. Styles, it is not what it was, n'est-ce pas, but it is not the house that concerns me. It is the people within it. His gaze drifted to the window, where rain had begun to patter against the panes. There is a darkness here, Hastings, a shadow that moves unseen. Hastings, stirring his tea, frowned. You're being cryptic, old chap. What's this about? Another case? Poirot's smile was faint, almost wistful. Perhaps the last, mon ami. My body fails, but the little grey cells, they are as sharp as ever. and they tell me something, is very wrong. Before Hastings could press further, the door opened, admitting the other guests. First came Judith Norton, a pale young woman with wide, anxious eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her bracelet. She was heiress to a considerable fortune, Poirot whispered, due to inherit on her 25th birthday, now mere weeks away. Her brother, Stephen, followed her, tall, angular man with a sullen air and a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes flicked over Hastings with disinterest, settling on Poirot with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Dr. Franklin Cole entered. Next, a handsome man in his 40s, his charm as polished as his gold watch chain. He greeted Poirot with a deference that felt rehearsed, his smile lingering a fraction too long. Last was Edward Allerton, a quiet, unremarkable man with thinning hair and a mild voice that seemed to apologize for his presence. Yet his eyes, Hastings noticed, were sharp, darting from face to face as if cataloguing every gesture. Dinner was announced, and the group moved to the dining room, where a tarnished silver candelabra cast flickering shadows. The meal was simple soup, roast chicken, and a tepid pudding, but the conversation was strained. Judith spoke haltingly of her plans to travel, her voice trembling as Stephen interrupted with a barbed remark about her foolish fancies. Dr. Cole steered the talk to local history, his anecdotes smooth but hollow, while Allerton said little, offering only a soft comment on the weather. Poirot, seated at the table's head, ate sparingly, his attention fixed on the interplay of words and glances. Later, in the privacy of Poirot's room, Hastings voiced his confusion. "They're an odd lot, I'll grant you, but what's this darkness you speak of?" "A crime." Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Not a crime, Hastings, not yet, but the potential for one. There is a mind here, subtle and dangerous, that weaves discord. I have seen such minds before. They do not kill with their hands, but with their words, their suggestions. They plant the seed, and others reap the harvest of death." Hastings shivered, the fire's warmth doing little to dispel the chill of Poirot's words. Outside, the rain drummed harder, and Styles Court seemed to close in around them, its walls heavy with secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The shadow of suspicion, the dining room at Styles Court, though grand in its proportions, bore the weight of neglect. The mahogany table, once polished to a mirror's sheen, was dulled by years of dust, and the portraits lining the walls gazed down with faded disapproval. The candelabra's flickering light cast jagged shadows, lending an air of unease to the evening's gathering. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated to the right of Hercule Poirot, felt the tension in the room, like a taut wire ready to snap. The guests, though outwardly civil, seemed to orbit one another with guarded caution, their words measured, their glances sharp. Poirot, frail in his wheelchair, yet commanding in presence, presided over the table with the quiet intensity of a conductor before a discordant orchestra. The meal began with a thin consomme, served by the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Luttrell, whose angular features and tight-lipped demeanour suggested she disapproved of the company as much as the state of the house. Judith Norton, the young heiress, sat opposite Hastings, her delicate hands fidgeting with her spoon. Her eyes, large and hazel, darted nervously toward her brother, Stephen, who slouched in his chair, his dark hair falling untidily over his brow. Stephen's sullenness was palpable, his responses to conversation curt and tinged with irritation. Dr. Franklin Cole, seated beside Judith, exuded an effortless charm, his voice smooth as he recounted a tale of a recent medical conference. London. Edward Allerton, at the table's far end, was a study in reticence, his mild voice offering only occasional murmurs of agreement, his grey eyes flitting from face to face as if memorizing their expressions. Poirot, sipping sparingly at his tisane, observed the scene with an intensity that belied his physical frailty. His fingers, gnarled but steady, traced the rim of his cup as he listened to the ebb and flow of talk. Hastings, attuned to his friend's habits, knew that Poirot was not merely absorbing the words but dissecting the silences between them. The detective's earlier warning echoed in Hastings' mind. A shadow moved among them, a manipulator who orchestrated discord without ever raising a hand. The idea was unsettling, almost fantastical, yet Poirot's certainty was unshakable. The conversation turned to Styles itself, prompted by Dr. Cole's remark on the house's storied past. "A place like this," he said, his smile polished, "must hold 1,000 secrets. Old houses always do." Judith shivered slightly, her bracelet clinking against her glass. "I wish it didn't," she said softly. "It feels watchful." "Somehow," Stephen snorted, draining his wine. "Nonsense, Judy. It's just a drafty old pile. You've been reading too many Gothic novels." His tone was sharp, and Judith flushed, her eyes dropping to her plate. Allerton spoke then, his voice so quiet it barely carried. "Old houses do have a way of holding on to their histories, Miss Norton, but it's the people within them who make the stories." His words were innocuous, yet Hastings felt a prickle of unease. There was something in Allerton's gazer, fleeting intensity that jarred with his otherwise unremarkable demeanor. Poirot's head tilted slightly, as if catching a note others missed. The meal progressed to a dry roast chicken, the silence broken only by the clink of cutlery and Mrs. Luttrell's brisk movements as she cleared plates. Dr. Cole, ever the conversationalist, turned to Poirot. "You've stayed here before, Mr. Poirot, haven't you? I heard you solved a rather notorious case in these very walls." His tone was light, but his eyes held a glint of curiosity. Poirot's smile was faint, almost ghostly. "Oui, monsieur. Many years ago. Styles was the stage for a tragedy then, as it may be again." The words hung in the air, and Hastings saw Judith's hand tremble as she reached for her water. Stephen's jaw tightened, and even Dr. Cole's practiced smile faltered. Only Allerton seemed unmoved, his expression bland as he buttered a roll. After dinner, the party adjourned to the drawing-room, where a meagre fire sputtered in the grate. Judith excused herself early, citing a headache, and Stephen followed soon after, muttering about needing air. Dr. Cole lingered, engaging Poirot in a discussion of criminal psychology, his questions probing yet carefully framed. "Surely," he said, "most crimes are impulsive, driven by passion or desperation. A calculated mind is rare, isn't it?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Rare, perhaps, but all the more dangerous, Doctor. The mind that plans without acting is a shadow that casts a long net." Allerton, who had been leafing through a worn copy of the Times, looked up briefly, his lips twitching as if suppressing a smile. Hastings, watching him, felt a flicker of suspicion. The man's quietness was not shyness, he realized, but a deliberate choice, a cloak for something sharper beneath. When the hour grew late, Poirot signalled for Hastings to wheel him to his room, a small ground-floor chamber, adapted for his condition. The room was sparsely furnished, its only luxury a shelf of books and a silver-framed photograph of Poirot in his prime, standing beside Hastings at a long-forgotten gala. As Hastings adjusted the blanket over Poirot's knees, The detective spoke in a low voice. You have observed them, Hastings. What do your instincts tell you? Hastings hesitated, his practical mind grappling with Poirot's cryptic hints. They're a tense bunch, I'll give you that. Stephen's got a chip on his shoulder, Judith's jumpy as a cat, and Dr. Cole's a bit too smooth for my liking. But Allerton, he's just there. Hardly says a word. If anyone's scheming, I'd wager on Cole. Poirot's chuckle was dry, like the rustle of autumn leaves. Ah, Hastings, always you look at the surface. Dr. Cole is a man of ambition, but he is an open book. Allerton, however, he is the one to watch. His silence is not empty. It is filled with purpose. He listens, he observes, and he plants. Seeds. Seeds. Hastings frowned, settling into a chair beside Poirot's bed. You keep talking about manipulation, but how can a man like Allerton Meek as a mouse make anyone do anything? Poirot's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. You recall, mon ami, the case of which I spoke years ago, the one I called X. A man who never killed, yet caused death after death. He whispered doubts, stoked jealousies, nudged the weak toward their breaking points. Allerton, I fear, is such a man. His weapon is the mind of others, and his crime is invisible. Hastings shifted uncomfortably, the fire's glow doing little to warm the chill of Poirot's words. That's a tall order, Poirot. You're saying he's some sort of puppet master, pulling strings we can't see. What's his motive? Motive, Poirot said softly, is often simple power, control, or the thrill of chaos. But we must be certain. Tomorrow, Hastings, you will. Watch him closely. Note who he speaks to, what he says, and what he does not say. The little grey cells, they sense the pattern, but it is not yet clear. Sleep did not come easily to Hastings that night. His room, on the second floor, overlooked the tangled gardens, where moonlight cast eerie shapes among the overgrown shrubs. The house creaked and groaned, as if protesting its own decay. He thought of Poirot, frail yet resolute, chasing a shadow that might exist only in his imagination. Yet Poirot's instincts were rarely wrong, and the memory of their first case, at Styles a murder solved by Poirot's relentless logic, gave Hastings pause. If there was a manipulator among them, he would trust Poirot to unmask him. The next morning, breakfast was a subdued affair. Judith, pale and drawn, picked at her toast, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had not slept. Stephen was absent, reportedly nursing a hangover in his room. Dr. Cole, fresh and composed, read the morning paper, occasionally glancing at Judith with an expression Hastings couldn't quite read: concern, perhaps, or calculation. Allerton, as usual, was unobtrusive, complimenting Mrs. Luttrell on the marmalade with a sincerity that felt oddly rehearsed. Poirot joined them late, his wheelchair maneuvered by a young maid who hovered anxiously until he waved her away. He declined food, taking only a cup of weak tea, and his silence drew curious glances from the others. Hastings, following Poirot's instructions, kept his attention on Allerton. The man's movements were precise, almost delicate, as he spread butter on his toast, but his eyes never lingered on one spot for long. When Judith mentioned a letter from her solicitor, Allerton's head tilted slightly, as if a switch had been flicked. Legal matters can be so tiresome, Allerton said, his tone sympathetic. Have you found your solicitor helpful, Miss Norton? The question was innocuous, yet Judith's shoulders tensed, and she murmured something about delays in her inheritance. Hastings, watching, felt a stir of unease. Allerton's words were harmless, but their effect was not. After breakfast, Poirot requested a private word with Judith in the library. Hastings, stationed outside, caught snippets of their conversation probing Judith's halting replies about her fears for the future. "I feel as if I'm being watched," she said at one point, her voice trembling, not just by the house, but by someone. Poirot's response was too low to hear, but when Judith emerged, her face was pale but resolute, as if a weight had shifted, if not lifted. In the afternoon, Poirot summoned Hastings to the garden, where they sat beneath a gnarled oak, its branches bare against the grey sky. The air was damp, carrying the scent of earth and decay. Poirot's blanket was tucked tightly around him, and his breath came in shallow rasps, yet his eyes burned with purpose. "You have seen Allerton at work, Hastings. He does not command, he suggests. He does not threaten, he unsettles. Already he has planted a seed in Miss Norton's mind, doubt, fear, suspicion. If we do not act, that seed will grow." Hastings, still skeptical, ran a hand through his greying hair. "I see a quiet man who asks polite questions. Poirot, you see a mastermind. How do we prove it? If he's as clever as you say, he won't leave evidence lying about." Poirot's smile was grim. "Evidence, mon ami, is not always a footprint or a bloodstain. It is in the patterns of behavior, the ripples of influence. We will watch, we will listen, and we will wait, but not too long, for I fear time is not on our side." As they returned to the house, a gust of wind swept through the garden, rattling the bare branches and carrying a faint, unsettling whisper. Hastings glanced at Poirot, whose face was set in a mask of determination. The shadow of suspicion had fallen over Styles, and Hastings knew that Poirot, even in his final days, would not rest until it was brought to light. Chapter 3. A troubling incident. The morning mist clung to the gardens of Styles Court like a shroud, softening the outlines of the unkempt hedges and lending the estate an air of ghostly quiet. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing at his bedroom window, felt the weight of the previous evening's unease settle deeper into his bones. Poirot's warnings about Edward Allerton, a man who, to Hastings' practical eye, seemed little more than a bland observer, had kept him awake, his mind turning over the possibility of an invisible manipulator. The house itself seemed complicit, its creaking timbers and shadowed corners whispering of secrets. Long-buried breakfast had barely begun when a piercing scream shattered the stillness. The sound came from the garden, high and frantic, cutting through the clatter of teacups. Hastings, seated at the dining table with Dr. Franklin Cole and Edward Allerton, leapt to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. Judith Norton's voice was unmistakable, laced with panic. Without a word, the men hurried toward the French doors. Mrs. Luttrell, trailing behind, her stern face creased with alarm, in the garden. Beneath a gnarled yew tree, Judith knelt in the damp grass, her hands clutching the lifeless form of her spaniel, Toby. The dog's glossy coat was matted with dew, its eyes dull and unseeing. A piece of raw meat, half-eaten, lay nearby, its edges tinged with a faint greenish powder. Judith's sobs were raw, her delicate frame shaking as she cradled the animal. "Toby, oh Toby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Who would do this?" Dr. Cole, ever the professional, knelt beside her, his fingers gently probing the dog's body. "Poison," he said grimly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the meat. "Strychnine, by the look of it. A cruel choice." He glanced at Judith, his tone softening. "I'm so sorry, Miss Norton. This was no accident." Hastings, his heart twisting at Judith's distress, scanned the scene. The garden was bordered by dense shrubs, offering ample cover for someone to place the bait unnoticed. Stephen Norton, Judith's brother, emerged from the house, his face flushed from sleep or liquor. "What's all this?" he demanded, his voice thick. When he saw Toby, his expression darkened. "Damn it, Judy, I told you to keep that dog leashed. Probably ate something it shouldn't." Judith's head snapped up, her eyes blazing through. "Tears. Don't you dare, Stephen. This was deliberate. Someone did this." Her accusation hung in the air, and Hastings caught Allerton's subtle shifter slight tilt of his head, as if filing away her words. Poirot, wheeled to the scene by the young maid, surveyed the tableau with a gaze that seemed to pierce the morning fog. His face, pale and drawn, betrayed no emotion, but his fingers tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, addressing Judith, "this is a great sorrow. Permit me to offer my condolences." His voice was soft, but his eyes flicked to the meat, then to the faces around him, lingering briefly on Allerton. Mrs. Luttrell, practical as ever, suggested calling the local constable, but Poirot raised a hand. "Naine, madame. This is not a matter for the police, not yet, but we must preserve the evidence." He directed Hastings to fetch a cloth to cover the meat, preserving it for analysis. As Hastings complied, he noticed Allerton's calm demeanor, the man standing slightly apart, his hands clasped behind his back. There was no shock in his expression, only a quiet watchfulness that sent a chill through Hastings' back in the drawing room. The household gathered, the air thick with unease. Judith, wrapped in a shawl, sat by the fire, her eyes red but her jaw set. Stephen paced, muttering about the groundskeeper, a surly man named Gibbs, who had once complained about Toby's barking. "He's got a grudge," Stephen insisted. "I've seen him skulking about, muttering curses. I'll have his hide for this." Poirot, positioned near the hearth, shook his head. "Monsieur Norton, you leap to conclusions. The may be ill-tempered, but this acted is too precise, too deliberate. Strychnine is not a common poison, nor one easily obtained. This was no impulse." His voice was weak but carried an authority that silenced Stephen's bluster. Dr. Cole, leaning against the mantel, nodded. "Strychnine's a nasty business. It takes knowledge to use it, effectively knowledge of chemistry or medicine." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Hastings caught a fleeting glance between him and Judith, as if gauging her reaction. Allerton spoke then, his voice soft and measured. "It's a terrible thing, Miss Norton. Perhaps someone meant to harm a pestrats. Perhaps Sandpoor Toby was an unintended victim." His words were sympathetic, yet they struck Hastings as oddly calculated, as if testing the room's response. Judith's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the fire. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he gestured for Hastings to wheel him to a quieter corner. In a low voice, he said, "This is no accident, Hastings, nor a case of mistaken targets. The death of this dog is a message, a warning, perhaps, or a trial run. Our shadow is bold, testing the waters of chaos." Hastings frowned, his practical mind struggling with Poirot's abstractions. A warning to whom? Judith. And why a dog? "It's cruel, but it's not murder." Poirot's smile was grim. "Not yet, mon ami. But consider. The poison was placed where Toby would find it, where Judith would discover him. This act strikes at her heart, her trust. It sows fear, and fear is a fertile ground for manipulation." Hastings glanced at Judith, who was now speaking quietly with Dr. Cole, her hands twisting the shawl. "You still think Allerton's behind this?" he asked. He barely reacted, didn't even seem surprised. "Precisement," Poirot murmured. "His calm is not innocence. It is control. He watches, he listens, and he acts only when unseen. But we will see him, Hastings. We must." The afternoon brought a somber task. Judith, accompanied by Hastings, and Dr. Cole buried Toby in a quiet corner of the garden beneath a rose bush that had once bloomed vibrantly. Judith's tears fell silently as she patted the earth, and Hastings, awkward but earnest, offered a clumsy word of comfort. Dr. Cole, standing nearby, spoke of the dog's loyalty, his tone warm but tinged with a professionalism that felt rehearsed. Allerton, notably absent, had excused himself to write letters, a task that struck Hastings as conveniently timed. Later, Poirot summoned Judith to his room for a private conversation. Hastings, stationed outside, caught fragments of their exchange. Judith's halting admission of her fears, not just for Toby, but for herself. "I feel like I'm being watched," she said, her voice barely audible, not just by Stephen or Dr. Cole, but someone else. "It's like they know my every thought." Poirot's response was too soft to hear, but when Judith emerged, her face was pale yet resolute, as if she had found a flicker of courage. That evening, over a subdued dinner, the conversation turned to the poison. Dr. Cole, with an air of authority, explained strychnine's effects: convulsions, agony, death within hours. "It's a chemist's tool," he said, "or a doctor's, in small doses, but this was no therapeutic use." Stephen, his temper frayed, snapped, "Then who's got access to it?" "Not me, not Judy. Gibbs, maybe he's got a shed full of rat poison." Poirot, picking at his soup, shook his head. "The source of the poison is less important than the intent, Monsieur Norton. This was no act of vengeance against a barking dog. It was meant to unsettle, to destabilize, and it has succeeded." His gaze swept the table, lingering on Allerton, who met it with a bland smile as the meal ended. Poirot tasked Hastings with a discreet errand to question Mrs. Luttrell about the household's routines, particularly who had access to the gardens at night. The housekeeper, brisk and unyielding, confirmed that the French doors were often left unlocked, a habit from laxer times. "Anyone could have slipped out," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Even one of the guests." Her tone suggested she suspected everyone, but she offered no names. Back in Poirot's room, Hastings reported his findings, his frustration mounting. "It's a needle in a haystack, Poirot. No witnesses, no fingerprints, just a dead dog and a house full of suspects. If Allerton's your man, he's covered his tracks well." Poirot's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "He is clever, Hastings, but not infallible. The little grey cells, they see the pattern forming. This act was a spark, meant to ignite something larger. We must watch closely, for the next move will be bolder and far more dangerous." As Hastings left Poirot's room, the house seemed to close in around him, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying the faint, bitter scent of the garden where Toby had died. The stage was set, and Hastings knew that Poirot, even in his frailty, was preparing to confront a darkness that thrived in the unseen corners of human hearts. Chapter 4. The mind of the master. The morning after Toby's death dawned grey and heavy, the air thick with the promise of rain. Styles Court seemed to crouch under the weight of its own secrets, its windows like unblinking eyes watching the uneasy household. Captain Arthur Hastings, stirring his coffee in the dining room, felt the strain of the previous day's events etched into the faces around him. Judith Norton, pale and withdrawn, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breakfast untouched. Stephen Norton, nursing a headache and a glass of water, muttered complaints about the damp weather, his temper barely restrained. Dr. Franklin Cole, composed as ever, read a medical journal, though his eyes flicked upward now and then, as if gauging the room's mood. Edward Allerton, seated at the table's far end, spread jam on his toast with the precision of a watchmaker, his expression serene yet impenetrable. Hercule Poirot, wheeled in by the young maid, looked frailer than ever, his skin almost translucent. In the dim light, yet his presence commanded attention, his sharp gaze sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Hastings, attuned to his friend's subtleties, noted the slight tremor in Poirot's hands, a sign of his worsening condition. The detective declined food, accepting only a cup of chamomile tisane, its faint aroma a stark contrast to the rich chocolate he once favored. Bon matin, mes amis, Poirot said, his voice soft but clear. I trust you have slept, though I suspect sleep was elusive for some. Judith's lips twitched, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on her plate. Stephen grunted, hard to sleep with all this nonsense about poisoned dogs. Dr. Cole folded his journal, his smile polite, but guarded. A tragedy, to be sure, but let's hope it's an isolated incident. Allerton, as usual, offered only a nod, his silence a canvas onto which others projected their unease. After breakfast, Poirot requested Hastings' assistance in his room, a small chamber that smelled faintly of lavender and liniment. The detective's bed was neatly made, its simplicity at odds with the ornate furniture of Styles' heyday. A single bookshelf held volumes of Balzac and Dickens, their spines worn from use, and the silver-framed photograph of Poirot and Hastings in younger days stood sentinel on the nightstand. As Hastings settled into a chair, Poirot leaned forward, his eyes alight with a fire that belied his physical decline. Hastings, he began, you have seen the ripples of yesterday's act, the fear in Mademoiselle Judith, the anger in her brother, the careful neutrality of Dr. Cole. But it is Allerton who holds my attention. His calm is not that of innocence, but of calculation. He is, I believe, the architect of this discord. Hastings shifted, his skepticism warring with his trust in Poirot's instincts. I've watched him, Poirot, as you asked. He's quiet, polite, almost invisible. But you're saying he's orchestrating all this poisoning dogs, unsettling Judith. It's a leap, old chap. What's his game? Poirot's fingers steepled, a gesture as familiar to Hastings as his own reflection. His game, mon ami, is control, not the control of force, but of the mind. He is like a chess master who moves no pieces himself, but whispers to others where to place their knights and rooks. The death of the dog was no random cruelty, was a blow to Judith's heart, designed to weaken her resolve, to make her doubt those around her. And doubt, Hastings, is a crack through which darker impulses creep. Hastings frowned, recalling Allerton's mild words at breakfast, his sympathetic glance toward Judith. He suggested the poison might have been for rats. Seemed reasonable to me. Reasonable, oui, but convenient, Poirot countered. His words deflect suspicion, yet they plant a seed. The idea that danger lurks in the ordinary. He does not accuse, he suggests, and in suggestion lies his power. Poirot's voice dropped, his gaze distant. I have seen such a one before. Hastings. Years ago, I spoke to you of X, a shadow who caused death without touching the weapon. Allerton, I fear, is cut from the same cloth. The memory stirred unease in Hastings. He recalled Poirot's tales of a figure who manipulated others into murder, their hands stained while his remained clean. The idea was chilling, almost fantastical, yet Poirot's conviction was unshakable. "What do we do then?" Hastings asked. "If he's as clever as you say, he won't leave evidence lying about." Poirot's smile was faint, almost sorrowful. "Evidence, mon ami, is not always a tangible thing. It is in the patterns of behavior, the subtle shifts in mood. Your task is to observe Allerton closely, not just what he says, but how others react to him. Watch Mademoiselle Judith in particular. She is vulnerable, and he knows it." Hastings nodded, though his mind churned with doubts. He left Poirot to rest and took to the gardens, where the air was sharp with the scent of wet earth. His task was clear but daunting: to shadow a man who seemed to blend into the wallpaper, leaving no trace of his intentions. As he walked the overgrown paths, he spotted Judith near the rosebush where Toby had been buried, her figure small against the vastness of the estate. She was alone, her head bowed, and Hastings hesitated, torn between respecting her grief and Poirot's directive. Before he could approach, Allerton appeared. His approach so quiet it seemed he had materialized from the mist. "Miss Norton," he said, his voice gentle, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to say again how sorry I am about Toby." Judith looked up, her eyes red but guarded. "Thank you, Mr. Allerton. It's kind of you." Her voice was polite but strained, and Hastings, watching from a distance, noted the way her shoulders tensed. Allerton knelt beside the rosebush, his movements deliberate. He was a fine dog. It's hard to lose a companion. "I had a terrier once. You lost him to a careless farmer's trap. It leaves a hole, doesn't it?" His tone was warm, almost intimate, and Judith's expression softened, though her hands twisted her scarf. "It does," she murmured. "I keep thinking, what if it wasn't an accident? What if someone meant to hurt him?" Allerton's head tilted, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of something Hastings couldn't name. "A troubling thought," he said, "but who would do such a thing? Perhaps it's best not to dwell on it. Grief can make us see enemies where there are none." His words were soothing, yet they carried a subtle weight, as if nudging Judith toward doubt. Hastings, hidden by a yew hedge, felt a prickle of suspicion. Allerton's sympathy seemed genuine, yet there was an undercurrent calculated ease that echoed Poirot's warnings. As Allerton walked away, Judith remained by the rosebush, her expression troubled, and Hastings made a mental note to report the exchange to Poirot. That afternoon, Poirot, too weak to leave his room, summoned Dr. Cole for a private conversation. Hastings, stationed outside, caught only fragments of Poirot's probing questions about strychnine, Cole's guarded responses about its medical uses. "It's tightly controlled," Cole said at one point, his voice smooth. "Only a chemist or a doctor could procure it, and even then, it's rare." Poirot's reply was inaudible, but when Cole emerged, his face was composed, though his fingers drummed against his thigh. Over tea, Poirot shared his observations with Hastings. "Dr. Cole is a man of secrets," he said, "but not, I think, our shadow. He is ambitious, perhaps too fond of Mademoiselle Judith's fortune, but his motives are transparent. Allerton, however, he is opaque, a mirror reflecting only what others wish to see." Hastings recounted the garden encounter, and Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You see, Hastings, he sows doubt, then offers comfort, binding her to him, It is a subtle art, but a dangerous one. We must be vigilant, for the next act in his play will be bolder. As evening fell, Styles grew quieter, the rain pattering against the windows like a restless spirit. Hastings, retiring to his room, felt the weight of Poirot's words. The detective's mind, though trapped in a failing body, was a beacon in the gathering dark. But the question lingered. Could they unmask Allerton before his unseen hand struck again? The house, with its creaking floors and shadowed halls, offered no answers, only the promise of more secrets to come. Chapter 5. A second tragedy, the rain that had threatened Styles Court all morning, broke at last. A steady downpour that drummed against the ancient roof and turned the gardens into a quagmire. Captain Arthur Hastings, peering through the drawing-room window, felt the gloom seep into his bones, as if the weather itself mirrored the unease that had settled over the household. The death of Judith Norton's spaniel, Toby, lingered like a sour note, and Hercule Poirot's cryptic warnings about Edward Allerton, a man whose mild manners cloaked a dangerous mind, kept Hastings on edge. The house, with its peeling wallpaper and creaking floors, seemed to pulse with secrets, each shadow a potential threat. Breakfast had been a tense affair, the clink of cutlery sharp against the silence. Judith, her eyes hollow from grief, barely spoke, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Stephen Norton, her brother, was late to the table, his face flushed and his shirt rumpled, suggesting a night spent with a bottle rather than in sleep. Dr. Franklin Cole maintained his polished demeanor, though his attempts at light conversation fell flat. Allerton, as ever, was a quiet presence, his soft-spoken comments on the rain and the state of the roads seeming to blend into the background. Poirot, wheeled in by the young maid, ate nothing, his gaze darting from face to face as if reading an invisible script. After breakfast, the household scattered, each retreating to their own corners of the sprawling manor. Poirot, too weak to venture far, remained in his ground-floor room. But he tasked Hastings with a new directive, to shadow Stephen, whose volatility seemed a fertile ground for Allerton's influence. "He is a man on the edge, Hastings," Poirot had said, his voice a faint rasp. "A push, however slight, could send him tumbling. Watch him, and watch Allerton's interactions with him." Hastings, ever dutiful, took to the task with a mix of resolve and skepticism. He found Stephen in the billiard room, a cavernous space where the green baize table was scarred from years of neglect. Stephen was nursing a glass of whiskey, despite the early hour, and muttering to himself as he lined up a shot. "Damned place," he growled, the cue ball skidding wide. "Damned people, all of them, sniffing around Judy's money like vultures." Hastings, leaning casually against the doorframe, ventured a neutral remark. "Rough morning, Norton. The rain doesn't help the mood." Stephen's eyes, bloodshot and sharp, flicked toward him. "It's not the rain, Hastings. It's this house, this circus." Cole, with his smarmy smile, "That Allerton fellow, creeping about like a ghost. And Judy, she's falling apart, and I can't do a thing about it." Before Hastings could probe further, Allerton appeared, as if summoned by the mention of his name. His approach was silent, his expression one of mild concern. "Mr. Norton, I hope I'm not interrupting. I couldn't help overhearing. You seem troubled. Is there anything I can do?" His voice was soft, almost soothing, but Hastings caught the faintest glint in his eyes, a sharpness that belied his words. Stephen snorted, slamming the cue onto the table. "Do. Unless you can get us out of this blasted place, there's nothing anyone can do." Allerton tilted his head, his smile sympathetic. It's a heavy burden, isn't it? Looking after your sister, with so many eyes on her fortune. One can't help but wonder who to trust. The words were gentle, but they struck a nerve. Stephen's face darkened, and he drained his glass in one gulp. Trust? There's none of that here. Not a damned bit. Hastings, watching the exchange, felt a chill. Allerton's comment was innocuous on its face, yet it seemed to fan the flames of Stephen's resentment. As Allerton excused himself, murmuring about a letter to write, Stephen muttered, "He's right, you know. No one's what. They seem—" Hastings made a mental note to report the encounter to Poirot, his unease growing. The day wore on, the rain unrelenting. Judith kept to her room, tended by Mrs. Luttrell, who reported the young woman was in a state and refused visitors. Dr. Cole, meanwhile, was seen in the library poring over a stack of papers that Hastings glimpsed were financial in nature, perhaps, or investment proposals. When questioned, Cole was evasive, claiming they were personal matters unrelated to Styles. Hastings, skeptical, wondered if Poirot's suspicions extended to the doctor, whose charm seemed a thin veneer over ambition. That evening, the tension in the household snapped like a brittle twig. Dinner had been a strained affair, with Stephen's temper fraying further under the influence of wine. He snapped at Judith for her silence, accusing her of moping like a child. And when Dr. Cole attempted to mediate, Stephen turned on him. "Keep your nose out of our business, Cole," he snarled, his voice slurring. "You're no better than the rest, sniffing around her money." The argument escalated in the drawing room, where Stephen, emboldened by drink, lunged at Cole, knocking a glass from his hand. The crash of crystal brought Mrs. Luttrell running, and Hastings, with the maid's help, separated the men. Cole, his composure shaken, brushed off his jacket and excused himself, while Stephen stormed upstairs, his curses echoing through the hall. Allerton, who had watched the scene with quiet detachment, offered a murmured apology and retired, leaving Hastings to wonder if the outburst had been spontaneous or provoked. The next morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. Hastings, rising early, found Mrs. Luttrell in the kitchen, her face pale. "It's Mr. Norton," she said, her voice tight. "He's not come down, and his door's locked." "I don't like it, Captain." Alarmed, Hastings fetched Dr. Cole, and together they forced the door to Stephen's room. The sight within stopped them cold. Stephen lay sprawled on his bed, unconscious, his face ashen. A bottle of sleeping pills, its contents spilled across the nightstand, told a grim story. Beside it was an empty whiskey glass, its rim smudged. Dr. Cole, moving swiftly, checked Stephen's pulse. "He's alive, thank God, but only just. An overdosed barbiturates, by the look of it." He administered a stimulant from his medical bag, and Stephen stirred, his breathing shallow but steadying. Mrs. Luttrell, hovering anxiously, was sent to fetch hot water and blankets, while Hastings stood frozen, his mind racing. An accident, or something darker. Poirot, informed of the crisis, insisted on being wheeled to Stephen's room despite his frailty. His eyes, sharp despite the shadows beneath them, took in the scene, the scattered pills, the glass, the dishevelled bed. "This is no accident." "Hastings," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the patter of rain outside. The pills were placed within his reach, and he was in a state to take them. Someone knew his weakness and exploited it. Hastings, shaken, protested. But who? Poirot. Stephen's been drinking himself into a stupor for days. He could have done this himself. Poirot's gaze was unyielding, Nan, mon ami. The timing, the precision it is too convenient. Our shadow has struck again, nudging a man toward ruin, and I fear this is but a prelude. As Stephen was moved to a guest room to recover under Dr. Cole's care, Poirot directed Hastings to search the room for any clue. In a drawer, tucked beneath a pile of crumpled shirts, Hastings found a scrap of paper, its edges frayed. Scrawled in an unfamiliar hand were the words, "Push and they fall." The phrase was cryptic, yet it sent a shiver through Hastings, echoing Poirot's talk of manipulation. He showed it to Poirot, whose face grew grim. "It is a taunt, Hastings, or perhaps a reminder. Our adversary is confident, but he will make a mistake." That afternoon, Poirot questioned Stephen, now groggy but coherent. The young man claimed no memory of taking the pills, only of drinking heavily after the fight with Cole. "I was angry," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Someone Allerton maybe said something about Judy not needing me anymore. It got under my skin." Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Dismissing Stephen with a gentle word, in the privacy of his room, Poirot confided to Hastings. "Allerton's words are like drops of poison, Hastings. He does not force, he suggests. To Stephen, he whispers of uselessness, to Judith, of fear. Each word is a thread in his web, and we must cut it before it tightens further." Hastings, clutching the cryptic note, felt the weight of Poirot's certainty. The rain continued to fall, blurring the world outside, and Styles Court seemed to close in, its walls heavy with the promise of more tragedy. Poirot, frail but resolute, was a lone sentinel against a shadow that grew bolder with each passing hour. Chapter 6. The web tightens. The rain had ceased, leaving Styles Court steeped in a damp, oppressive stillness. The air inside the manor was heavy, laden with the scent of old wood and wax polish, as if the house itself held its breath. Captain Arthur Hastings, pacing the corridor outside Hercule Poirot's room, felt the weight of recent events pressing down on him. The death of Judith Norton's dog, Toby, followed by Stephen Norton's near-fatal overdose, had cast a pall over the household. Poirot's conviction that Edward Allerton was a manipulator, orchestrating these tragedies without ever staining his hands, gnawed at Hastings' practical mind. Yet the cryptic note push, and they fall found in Stephen's room, lingered like a taunt, lending credence to Poirot's fears. Morning light filtered weakly through the drawing-room windows, where the guests gathered for a late breakfast. Judith, her face drawn and her eyes shadowed, sat with a cup of tea she did not drink, her gaze fixed on some distant point. Stephen, still pale from his ordeal, slumped in a chair, his usual bravado replaced by a sullen silence. Dr. Franklin Cole, ever the picture of composure, made polite conversation about the clearing weather, though his eyes darted to Judith with a concern that seemed almost proprietary. Allerton, as always, was unobtrusive, his mild voice offering a comment on the quality of the scones, his expression betraying nothing. Poirot, wheeled in by the young maid, took his place at the table's head, his frail form swathed in a shawl, his eyes sharp as ever. "Born Matin," Poirot said, his voice a fragile thread but laced with authority. "I trust you are all recovering from yesterday's excitement." His gaze swept the table, lingering briefly on Allerton, who met it with a bland nod. Judith flinched at the word excitement, her fingers tightening around her cup, while Stephen muttered something inaudible, his eyes on the floor after breakfast. Poirot summoned Judith to the library, a cavernous room lined with dusty tomes and faded tapestries. Hastings, stationed outside as was his habit, caught fragments of their conversation through the heavy oak door. Poirot's tone was gentle, almost paternal, as he probed Judith's state of mind. "Mademoiselle," he said, "you have suffered much the loss of your dear Toby, the distress of your brother. Tell me, do you feel safe here at Styles?" Judith's reply was halting, her voice trembling. "Safe? I don't know any more. Ever since we came here, it's as if there's a weight on me. Stephen's temper, Dr. Cole's questions about my plans, and Mr. Allerton, he's so kind, but I feel watched, like someone knows my every thought." Poirot's response was too soft to hear, but when Judith emerged, her face was pale yet resolute, as if she had unburdened a portion of her fear. Hastings reported this to Poirot, who nodded gravely. "She is the pivot, Hastings," he said, his voice low as they sat in his room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Allerton sees her vulnerability, her wealth, her isolation, and he weaves his web around her. But he is clever, oh, so clever. He does not threaten, he sympathizes. He does not command, he suggests, and in doing so, he tightens his hold." Hastings, clutching the memory of the note, frowned. "But what does he want, Poirot? Her money? Revenge? Or is it just chaos, like you said?" Poirot's eyes gleamed, though his breath came in shallow rasps. "Power, mon ami. The power to bend others to his will, to watch them break under the weight of their own fears. For such a man, the act is its own reward." Determined to uncover more, Poirot tasked Hastings with a new assignment, to observe Allerton's interactions with Dr. Cole, whose ambition might make him another pawn in Allerton's game. Hastings found Cole in the conservatory, a glass-walled room overgrown with wilted ferns, where the doctor was sorting through a stack of letters. His demeanor was cordial, but his answers to Hastings' casual inquiries were evasive. "Just business matters," Cole said, tucking the letters into his jacket. "Nothing to concern the household." Yet his fingers lingered on the papers, and Hastings caught a glimpse of figure sums, perhaps, or debts, later. Hastings overheard Allerton speaking with Cole in the hallway, their voices low but distinct. "You're a man of science," Dr. Allerton said, his tone mild. "You must find Miss Norton's situation fascinating, a young woman, so much wealth, so little experience. One wonders if she's equal to the responsibility." Cole's reply was cautious. "She's stronger than she looks, but, yes, it's a burden. I've offered to help, but she's wary." Allerton's voice dropped, almost a whisper, as she should be. "Trust is a fragile thing, easily broken." The words were innocuous, yet they carried a weight that made Hastings' skin prickle. Cole's response was a non-committal hum, but his expression, as he walked away, was troubled. Reporting this to Poirot, Hastings voiced his frustration. "It's all so vague. Poirot Allerton's words could mean anything or nothing. How do we prove he's behind Stephen's overdose? Or Toby's death? We've got a note, a few odd remarks, and your suspicions. It's not enough." Poirot's smile was faint, almost weary. "Patience, Hastings. The web tightens, but the spider is cautious. He knows we watch him, and he adjusts his steps. But he cannot hide forever. We must unsettle him, force a misstep." Poirot's plan was simple but bold. He would confront Allerton directly, not with accusations, but with questions designed to probe his composure. That evening, Poirot requested Allerton's company in his room, a move that surprised Hastings. "Are you sure, Poirot? If he's as dangerous as you say, isn't this risky?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. though his face was pale. Risk, mon ami, is necessary to unmask a shadow. I will not accuse, I will inquire. And in his answers, we may find a crack in his facade. The meeting took place after dinner, in the quiet of Poirot's chamber. Hastings, stationed outside, heard only murmurs, the cadence of Poirot's voice rising and falling like a melody, Allerton's responses soft and measured. The conversation lasted barely 15 minutes, but when Allerton emerged, his face was pale, his smile forced. He passed Hastings without a word, his steps quickening as he disappeared down the corridor. Poirot, when Hastings entered, was exhausted, his breath laboured. "It is done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have planted a seed of my own." Hastings a doubt in his mind that he is not as invisible as he believes. He will act soon, and we must be ready. Hastings, alarmed by Poirot's pallor, pressed for details, but the detective waved him off. "Tomorrow, mon ami. For now, I must rest. But keep your eyes open, for the next move in this game will be his hand. It will be dangerous." As Hastings retired to his room, the house seemed to pulse with a new tension, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. The web was tightening, but whether it would ensnare Allerton or draw them all into its strands remained to be seen. Poirot, frail but unyielding, was the only light in the gathering dark, and Hastings clung to his friend's certainty as the night closed in around Styles Court. Chapter 7. The moral dilemma. The air in Styles Court hung heavy with the residue of rain, the damp seeping into the walls and lending the manor an oppressive chill. Captain Arthur Hastings, rising early, felt the weight of the past day's events, like a stone in his chest. The poisoning of Judith Norton's dog, Toby, followed by Stephen Norton's near-fatal overdose, had cast a shadow over the household, and Hercule Poirot's relentless pursuit of Edward Allerton as the unseen manipulator behind these acts gnawed at Hastings' practical sensibilities. Yet the cryptic note push, and they fall and Allerton's subtle, unsettling presence lent credence to Poirot's fears. The detective's confrontation with Allerton the previous evening, though cloaked in secrecy, had left a palpable tension, as if the house itself sensed a storm approaching. Morning found the household subdued. At breakfast, Judith picked at her food, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant, as if steeling herself against further grief. Stephen, still weak from his ordeal, spoke little, his gaze flickering between suspicion and shame. Dr. Franklin Cole maintained his polished veneer, though his attempts at conversation felt strained, his smiles not quite reaching his eyes. Allerton, as ever, was a quiet figure, his mild comments on the improving weather blending into the background. Poirot, wheeled in by the young maid, looked frailer than Hastings had ever seen him, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly, as he sipped his tisane, yet his eyes burned with a fierce determination, a beacon in the gathering gloom. After breakfast, Poirot summoned Hastings to his room, a small sanctuary of order amidst the manor's decay. The fire crackled weakly, casting shadows on the walls, and the silver-framed photograph of Poirot and Hastings in brighter days seemed to mock the present. Poirot, wrapped in a shawl, gestured for Hastings to sit. "Mon ami," he said, his voice a fragile whisper, "we approach a crossroads. The shadow we pursue attends bolder now, but also more vulnerable. Last night I planted a doubt in his mind, a suggestion that he is seen. He will act, and soon. But we must be prepared for what follows." Hastings, unsettled by intensity, leaned forward. "What did you say to him, Poirot? He looked shaken when he left your room. Did you accuse him outright?" Poirot's smile was faint, almost sorrowful. None, Hastings. Accusations are crude, and he is too clever for that. I spoke of patterns, of minds that manipulate without touching the blade. I let him know that the little grey cells see through. His mask he is rattled, but he is not broken yet. The detective's words took a darker turn. There is a question, mon ami, that weighs heavily on me. If Allerton is, as I believe, a man who will kill again through others, what is our duty? To wait for evidence that may never come, to trust in courts that cannot see the invisible crime, or to act as justice demands, even if it means stepping beyond the law. Hastings stiffened, his practical nature recoiling. Beyond the law. Poirot, you can't mean you, of all people, breaking your code. You've always said justice is served by truth, not vengeance. Poirot's eyes, clouded with fatigue, held a steely resolve. And if the truth is not enough, Hastings, if lives hang in the balance, and the law is blind to the puppeteer's strings. I have spent my life in service to order, to morality. But there comes a moment when the moral man must ask, what is the greater sin, to act or to do nothing? The question hung between them, heavy as the damp air. Hastings, grappling with the implications, felt a chill that had little to do with the room's draught. You're talking about murder, Poirot, he said quietly, killing Allerton to stop him. That's not justice, it's playing God. Poirot's gaze did not waver. Perhaps, mon ami, but if God is silent, who must speak? The little grey cells, they see the pattern, and they know the cost of inaction. I do not decide lightly, Hastings, but I must decide. The conversation left Hastings shaken, his faith in Poirot's unyielding morality tested. He spent the day observing the household, his task now tinged with a new urgency. Judith in the garden seemed to draw strength from her grief, tending the rosebush where Toby was buried with a quiet resolve. Stephen, confined to his room under Dr. Cole's watch, was sullen but cooperative, his brush with death tempering his usual fire. Cole himself was busy, his medical bag open as he prepared a sedative for Stephen. Though Hastings noted the doctor's frequent glances toward Judith's room, as if weighing his next move, Allerton, meanwhile, was elusive, his presence as fleeting as a shadow. Hastings caught him in the library, leafing through a book on psychology, his fingers pausing on a passage about influence and suggestion. When Hastings approached, Allerton's smile was disarming. Fascinating subject, Captain, he said. The mind is so malleable, don't you think? A word here, a hint there, and people can be led anywhere. The comment was casual, yet it sent a prickle down Hastings' spine, echoing Poirot's warnings. That afternoon, Poirot requested a private meeting with Dr. Cole, a conversation Hastings was not privy to, but which left the doctor visibly unsettled. Emerging from Poirot's room, Cole's face was tight, his usual charm replaced by a distracted air. When Hastings inquired, Cole brushed him off. Just a discussion about Stephen's recovery, he said, though his eyes avoided Hastings. Suspicious Hastings reported this to Poirot, who nodded thoughtfully. The doctor is a pawn, Hastings, but a useful one. He feels the web tightening, though he does not yet see its strands. As evening approached, Poirot's health took a sharp decline. The maid, pale with worry, reported that he had refused lunch, his breath laboured and his pulse weak. Hastings, alarmed, insisted on calling a doctor, but Poirot waved him off. There is no time, mon ami. The game is nearing its end, and I must play my part. His words carried a finality that chilled Hastings, who sensed that Poirot's resolve was not just about unmasking Allerton, but about confronting a moral abyss. Dinner was a grim affair. The household gathered in the dining room under the flicker of a tarnished candelabra. Judith spoke little, her eyes darting to Allerton, who offered her a sympathetic smile that seemed to unsettle her further. Stephen, allowed to join them, was subdued, his hands shaking as he lifted his fork. Cole's attempts at levity fell flat, and Allerton, as always, said little, his presence a quiet undercurrent in the room's tension. After dinner, Poirot requested another meeting with Allerton, a move that surprised Hastings. "Again, Poirot?" he asked, wheeling the detective to his room. "What more can you say to him?" Poirot's eyes were feverish, his voice barely audible. "I must push Hastings as he pushes others. I must force his hand, or we will lose our chance." The meeting was brief, the murmurs too low for Hastings to discern, but when Allerton emerged, his face was ashen, his hands clenched at his sides. He avoided Hastings' gaze, retreating to his room with hurried steps. Poirot, when Hastings entered, was slumped in his wheelchair, his breath ragged. "It is done," he whispered. "I have challenged the spider, and now we wait for his move. But be vigilant, Hastings, for the night is dangerous." Exhausted, Poirot dismissed him, his eyes closing as if the effort had drained his last reserves. Hastings, retiring to his room, felt the house's oppressive silence close in. The moral dilemma Poirot had posed gnawed at him. Could a man of such principle truly contemplate and act beyond the law? The shadows of Styles seemed to whisper of choices and consequences, and as the clock struck midnight, Hastings knew that the web was tightening, drawing them all toward a reckoning that only Poirot could foresee. Chapter 8. The final act. The dawn broke over Styles Court with a reluctant light. The sky, a bruised grey that seemed to mirror the household's exhaustion. Captain Arthur Hastings, roused by a restless night, felt the weight of Hercule Poirot's moral dilemma pressing against his heart. The detective's frail condition, coupled with his chilling resolve to act outside the law to stop Edward Allerton, had left Hastings torn between loyalty and unease. The events of the past days, Toby's poisoning, Stephen's overdose, and Allerton's subtle manipulations, had woven a web of suspicion that tightened with each passing hour. Now, after Poirot's second confrontation with Allerton, the air in the manor felt charged, as if the walls themselves anticipated a climax. Morning brought a grim discovery. Mrs. Luttrell, the stern housekeeper, knocked urgently on Hastings' door, her face pale and her hands trembling. "It's Mr. Allerton, Captain," she said, her voice tight. He's dead. In his room. You must come at once." Hastings, his heart lurching, followed her through the silent corridors to Allerton's chamber on the second floor. The door stood ajar, and inside, the scene was stark. Edward Allerton lay slumped in an armchair by the window, his face grey, his eyes half open in a lifeless stare. A glass of brandy, half empty, rested on the table beside him, its amber liquid catching the weak morning light. A faint, acrid scent hung in the air, unmistakable to Hastings' trained senses. Poison dot, Dr. Franklin Cole, summoned moments later, confirmed the worst. "Cyanide," he said, his voice clipped as he examined the glass. "Quick and lethal. He's been dead for hours, since last night, I'd wager." His hands, usually steady, shook slightly as he capped his medical bag. Judith Norton, drawn by the commotion, stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Stephen, still weak from his own ordeal, leaned against the wall, his face a mask of confusion. "Good riddance," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Hastings, his mind racing, sent Mrs. Luttrell to fetch the local constable, though he knew Poirot would have preferred to handle matters discreetly. The household gathered in the drawing-room, a sombre assembly under the flickering chandelier. Judith's hands twisted her shawl, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Who would do this? Why?" Stephen, pacing, snapped, "He wasn't worth crying over, Judy. Probably crossed the wrong person." Dr. Cole, his composure fraying, urged calm, though his eyes darted nervously to the door. Poirot, wheeled in by the maid, was a ghostly figure, his face so pale it seemed carved from wax. His breath came in shallow gasps, yet his eyes burned with a fierce clarity. "Mies Amos," he said, his voice frail but commanding, "this is a grave moment. Monsieur Allerton is dead, and we must ask, who has ended his life, and why?" His gaze swept the room, lingering on no one, yet seeming to pierce each heart. Hastings, standing close, whispered Poirot, "You don't think—" "Surely this wasn't—" He trailed off, unable to voice the suspicion that gnawed at him. Poirot's confrontation with Allerton the previous night, his talk of acting beyond the lookhood he had taken such a drastic step. Poirot's expression gave nothing away, but his silence was heavy. A wall Hastings could not breach. The constable, a dour man named Inspector Reeves, arrived within the hour, his notebook open and his questions sharp. He interviewed each guest, but the answers were vague. No one had seen Allerton after dinner. No one had heard anything unusual. The brandy glass, sent for analysis, would take days to yield results, and Reeves, frustrated, declared it a likely suicide. Man like that, quiet, keeping to himself, probably had his demons, he said, snapping his notebook shut. Poirot, however, dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "Suicide, Inspector, nan. Monsieur Allerton was not a man to end his own life. He was too deliberate." His voice faltered, and he coughed, a painful sound that drew concerned glances. Hastings, alarmed, urged him to rest, but Poirot shook his head. "There is no time, mon ami. I must speak to you alone." In the privacy of Poirot's room, the detective's condition was alarmingly clear. His breath was laboured, his hands trembling as he clutched the arms of his wheelchair. "Hastings," he said, his voice barely audible, "I have little time left. You must listen, and you must trust me." He gestured to a sealed envelope on his nightstand. "Take this. Read it when I am gone. It will explain all." Hastings, his throat tight, protested. "Gone, Poirot. Don't talk like that. You need—" A doctor, rest Poirot's hand, frail but firm, gripped his wrist. "Non, mon ami, the little grey cells, they have done their work. But the cost is great." His eyes, clouded with pain, held a sorrow Hastings had never seen. "Promise me you will read the letter and keep its contents to yourself. It is my final request." Before Hastings could respond, Poirot's head slumped, his breath slowing to a faint rattle. Hastings called for Dr. Cole, but it was too late. Hercule Poirot, the greatest detective Hastings had ever known, died that afternoon, his heart finally giving way. The room seemed to dim, as if the light had fled with him, and Hastings, overcome with grief, clutched the envelope, its weight a burden he was not yet ready to bear. The household was plunged into chaos. Judith wept openly, her grief for Poirot mingling with her fear of the unknown. Stephen, shaken, retreated to his room, while Dr. Cole, his face grim, assisted the constable with formalities. Mrs. ever practical, prepared tea, though her hands shook as she poured. The manor, already heavy with secrets, seemed to groan under this new loss. Days later, alone in his London flat, Hastings opened Poirot's envelope, his hands trembling as he unfolded the letter. Written in Poirot's precise script, it was a confession that chilled him to the core. Poirot had poisoned Allerton, using cyanide slipped into his brandy during their final meeting. "I broke my code, Hastings," the letter read, "but I could not let him destroy more lives. Allerton was the shadow, the puppeteer who drove others to ruin Judith to fear, Stephen to despair, Cole to desperation. No court could convict him, for his crimes were invisible. I acted to save others, but the sin is mine. Forgive me, mon ami, and let my secret die with you." Hastings sat motionless, the letter trembling in his hands. Poirot, the champion of justice, had crossed a line Hastings could scarcely comprehend. Yet the evidence was there. In the patterns Poirot had seen, Allerton's whispers that stoked Stephen's rage, his subtle nudges that deepened Judith's fear, his probing questions that unsettled Cole. Each act, seemingly innocent, had been a thread in a deadly web, and Poirot, in his final act, had cut it. Burning the letter in his fireplace, Hastings honoured Poirot's wish, though the truth seared his heart. Styles, caught with its shadows and secrets, faded into memory, but the weight of Poirot's sacrifice would linger forever, a testament to a man who, even in his final hour, chose justice over law. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The days following Hercule Poirot's death and Edward. Allerton's poisoning draped Styles caught in a hush that felt almost sacred, as if the manor itself mourned the loss of its sharpest mind. Captain Arthur Hastings, his heart heavy with grief and the burden of Poirot's final confession, moved through the house like a man in a dream. The letter, now ashes in his London fireplace, had revealed a truth that shook the foundations of his faith in his friend Poirot. The unwavering champion of justice had taken a life to save others, poisoning Allerton to halt his invisible reign of manipulation. The weight of that secret, which Hastings had sworn to keep, pressed against him as he faced the task of tying up the loose ends at Styles. The morning after Poirot's passing, the household gathered in the drawing-room, a sombre assembly beneath the tarnished chandelier. Judith Norton, her eyes swollen from tears, sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly around a handkerchief. Stephen Norton, still pale from his overdose, but steadier now, leaned against the mantel, his usual bravado replaced by quiet unease. Dr. Franklin Cole, his polished charm dimmed, stood near the fire, his gaze distant as if wrestling with his own thoughts. Mrs. Luttrell, the housekeeper, bustled about with tea, her stern face softened by a rare trace of sorrow. The absence of Poirot and Allerton hung over them like a storm cloud, and the air was thick with unspoken questions. Inspector Reeves, the local constable, had concluded his investigation into Allerton's death with a verdict of suicide based on the lack of evidence suggesting foul play. The cyanide-laced brandy glass bore only Allerton's fingerprints, and no witnesses had seen anyone enter his room. "A troubled man, perhaps," Reeves had said, his tone final as he closed his notebook. "These quiet types often hide their demons." Hastings, knowing the truth, had nodded silently, his heart twisting at the lie he was forced to uphold. Judith, breaking the silence, spoke softly. "Mr. Poirot, he knew something, didn't he? About Mr. Allerton, about all of this?" Her voice trembled, and she looked to Hastings, her eyes searching. He was trying to protect us, wasn't he? Hastings, caught off guard, managed a nod. He was, Miss Norton. Poirot always sought the truth, whatever the cost. The words felt heavy, a half-truth that honoured Poirot's intent but concealed his final act. Stephen, his voice rough, interjected, "Protect us from what Allerton was, a nobody, a shadow. If he poisoned himself, good riddance. Maybe he's the one who tried to do me in." His words were defiant, but his eyes betrayed doubt, as if he sensed the deeper currents Poirot had. Uncovered, Dr. Cole, stirring his tea, spoke with a measured tone. "We may never know the full story. Mr. Poirot was a brilliant man, but his methods were unconventional. Perhaps he saw something we didn't." His gaze flicked to Hastings, a flicker of suspicion that made Hastings' skin prickle. Did Cole sense the truth, or was he merely probing, as he had so often with Judith's affairs? Hastings, eager to shift the focus, turned to Judith. "What will you do now, Miss Norton? With your inheritance coming, you've decisions to make." Judith's lips tightened, but her voice was steady. "I'm leaving Styles," she said. "This place, it's suffocating. I'll settle my father's estate in London, somewhere. I can breathe. And Stephen, he's promised to get help, proper help." She glanced at her brother, who nodded grudgingly, his hand brushing his brow as if to ward off a lingering shadow. Stephen's decision to seek treatment for his drinking and temper was a small victory, one Hastings knew Poirot would have approved. The young man's brush with death had shaken him, and Judith's resolve seemed to anchor him, at least for now. Dr. Cole, however, announced his departure abruptly, citing urgent business in London. "I've overstayed my welcome," he said, his smile strained. Styles has a way of wearing one down. His bags were packed by noon, and he left in a hired car. His parting glance at Judith, lingering just long enough to stir Hastings' suspicions. Was Cole fleeing Allerton's influence, or his own ambitions? Mrs. Luttrell, ever practical, began preparations to close the house, muttering about its upkeep being a burden no one wanted. Styles Court, with its faded grandeur and tangled gardens, seemed destined to fade into obscurity, its secrets buried with its last guests. Hastings, tasked with settling Poirot's affairs, found little to do. The detective's possessions were sparse, his will simple, leaving only a few books and the silver-framed photograph to Hastings, a keepsake that brought a lump to his throat. In the quiet of the garden, where Toby's grave lay beneath the rosebush, Hastings found himself alone, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. He thought of Poirot's letter, its words seared into his memory. "I broke my code, Hastings, but saved lives." The confession was a wound, yet it carried a strange clarity. Allerton's manipulations, his whispers, that stoked Stephen's despair, deepened Judith's fear, and nudged Cole toward greed had been a poison as deadly as the cyanide Poirot used. The detective had seen no other way, no court that could convict a man for crimes of the mind. Yet the act had cost him dearly, not just his life, but his soul's peace. Hastings wrestled with the moral weight of Poirot's choice. Had it been justice or vengeance cloaked in righteousness? The law, with its rigid scales, would call it murder, yet Hastings could not condemn his friend. Poirot had acted to protect, to sever a web that threatened more lives. The memory of Allerton's pale face, his forced smile after Poirot's final confrontation, haunted Hastings. Had the man known his fate, sensed the trap closing? Or had Poirot's act been as invisible as Allerton's own machinations? As he stood by the rosebush, a soft breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the faint scent of blooms long gone. Hastings made a decision. He would honour Poirot's wish, letting the secret die with him. Styles, with its shadows and sorrows, would fade into the past, and Poirot's legacy would remain untarnished, a beacon of truth in a world of deception. Leaving the garden, Hastings glanced back at the manor, its windows dark and unyielding. He would return to London, to a life forever altered by the loss of his friend. But in his heart he carried Poirot's final gift, the knowledge that even in his darkest hour, the detective had chosen to protect, whatever the cost. As he walked away, Styles Court seemed to sigh, its secret sealed at last, leaving only the echo of Poirot's sacrifice to linger in the quiet.